Ka tangi te titi, ka tangi te kaka, ka tangi a hau. E te atua nau rāti timatātanga me te whakamutunga o ngā mea katoa. Kati aki, amene. Me mihi a hau ki te mana whenua o Tāmaki Makaurau, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. E ngā manuhiri, e ngā hau e whā, nau mai, hari mai ki te hui nei. Nā reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. E mihi ana hau te mana whenua o Taranaki, ara ko Taranaki te maunga, ko te tairehua te moana, me waiwaka iho te awa, no uropi me inārangi o ko tipuna, ko Ngāti Pākehā te iwi, ko Biju te whānau, ko Denise tēnei, ti hei mauri ora. Kia ora and welcome to our Co-Matters webinar this morning, everyone. My name is Denise Biju and I'm your host today from not so sunny Tāmaki Makaurau, Auckland here in Aotearoa. Special welcome to those who were scheduled to join us at the Co-Matters National Community Innovation Symposium and Masterclass events. These were due to be held in Wellington earlier in March before COVID-19 changed the world. Inspiring communities and all our partners were really looking forward to hosting these three wonderful people, Liz, Mark and Jamie, in person. Instead, here we are hosting them online and I'm really looking forward to that. We had a fantastic prep session a couple of days ago and today's webinar is a small way to reach into some of the ideas and thinking that would have been hot topics at those Co-Matters events. And in many ways, actually, they're even more relevant now in this very different and fast-changing world that we live in. A very, very local world for most of us at the moment. So recognising that and that the experience of COVID-19 and lockdown is very different for different people, different households and communities, even those that are not far from one another. We also recognise that we have insights, practices and tools from our collective work in community innovation that can be useful to guide us forward. So although there's no playbook and we have immediate needs to deal with, this time can be one of innovation. It can be a time to consider what new normals we want to create together and begin working towards those, begin living them into being. And that's what we're going to dive into today. So I'm excited to host today's discussion with these wonderful people and let's introduce them. So joining me on the webinar today are Mark Cabaj. He's the principal of Here to There Consulting. Kia ora, Mark. How are you doing?
Hello, Denise. Hello, everybody.
Where are you calling from?
I am in Edmonton, Alberta today, close to the Rocky Mountains on the east side of them. A town full of snow.
Oh, that's very hard for me to comprehend right now.
It is.
But awesome, thanks for joining us. And we also have Jamie Gamble, Principal of Imprint Consulting. Tēnā koe, Jamie, how are you doing today? Where are you?
Kia ora, Denise. Kia ora, koutou katoa. I'm joining from New Brunswick on the Atlantic side of Canada. And it's a lovely spring day, Mark, but we have 20 centimeters on our forecast, so we'll catch up to you soon.
20 centimeters?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's how we roll in Canada.
You live in a different world to me. And Liz, morning Liz, she's the co-CEO of Tamarack Institute. Tēnā koe, how are you doing today? Where are you?
So I'm in the middle of Canada in Ontario and looks like it's going to rain outside. We have no snow. We actually have green grass and I was thinking today that it might not be too long till we take out the lawnmower and have our first cut of the grass in our yard. So not in the west or the east, it's in the center. We actually have kind of nice weather.
Sounds like a bit of rivalry going on there, but we're not going to get into that. Listeners, you can join in too if you wish. The questions, as the opening said, can be asked in the question box as we go along. And remember to vote on the questions too that resonate with you, so these are the questions that get asked. Let's get started, Jamie, perhaps with the short video of some of the things that are already happening here in Aotearoa.
Here in Whananaki, we have a vision of a culturally connected, caring community.
Community development, we didn't know what the hell that was. We didn't know what that was. It was just a catchphrase and everybody was saying it. But what we thought it was listen to the community, figure out what we have, and then let's develop that.
CLD is about learning as you go. You don't know all the answers.
This is a process where you've got to get involved and it's going to take time. If you're looking at real change, it just doesn't happen overnight.
It's not till you start the journey and take those steps, you start to learn things. So that's why they say learning by doing, but it's also learning by sharing.
ISK was started probably sometime around 2010, and it was birthed really out of frustration and a lack of understanding as to how can we transform our community and what's going wrong in our community. My personal involvement really started in about 2012 after a spat of youth suicides that occurred in our town. Having communities who are to talk about these things and to start articulating a vision which is going to change the settings, which will then change the outcomes, has been just a constant daily part of life for us. 20 years ago we ran a program for youth in rangatahi. At the time we had hardly any facilities at all in the community. We had a whole lot of problems with rangatahi and wondering why they were getting in trouble. We knew that we have people that have talent, have potential. It was creating an environment that allowed them to shine, to do stuff, try stuff.
Some of the work that we're doing is about our environment, our spaces, our gathering places, I guess about the people and the activities, opportunities to come together.
There's a real multi-layer approach to it. We can look at the firewood project, for example, and we bring together the fire service, the Housing New Zealand, the residents, the community groups, and they're working together as equals, delivering firewood.
And then we used this on one project. We had Be Who You're Born to Be. Understand what we do have as a community. How do we build on those assets? Oh, young people, oh, that's a problem. Well, actually, how do we flip that and say, how do we make that the potential? So it was really around readjusting our thinking around it being the problem to it being the solution. And that was a big learning for us.
Provincial Growth Fund is going to invest in the Kawarapūtuaki industrial development. That's a significant step forward for us. That gives us all of the infrastructure and the framework to create what we believe is the best industrial development in New Zealand.
So we're now getting to that mindset change in the community of we, the residents, can actually make a difference. How do we do it? And with having the agencies and NGOs and community groups there, realising that their role is not to solve problems, but to actually support the community, the residents, to actually achieve the outcomes that are important to them, we've got that support base.
Our CLD group comes together every month. They're like open groups, and really everybody's supposed to try and bring somebody else along to those meetings. But we have a consistent leadership group who are always there. I think we've got a ways to go, but I can see the momentum and the power of working collaboratively.
So we did a bit of a stock take around the services that we offer and looked at what were some of the barriers to participation. So for example, looking at the fine structure at the library and seeing that that is definitely a gap and a barrier for some whānau who potentially didn't bring 2 books back, and so they discontinue lending.
What's important is that you have this core group of people and this sense of obligation to future generations. That's what actually keeps the group together.
In our role here, we are able to influence, and we have amazing partnerships. And so working together on this project has meant that 120 children have had a really great year at school.
And the more you start to engage people in the kaupapa, so to speak, I think the more everybody benefits. Not only get the outcomes we want, but enjoy the learning from each other. And we're starting to see that happen.
I loved watching it. People there that I haven't been able to see, and so much to work with and so much to build on. Even in this space of uncertainty and fear, there's potential. We have potential. So how do we activate that? What are your thoughts, Mark? Let's get started.
Thanks, Denise. And again, kia ora, everyone. Yeah, that was a great video because it just reminds us that change can happen at multiple scales. And I was sure looking forward to joining you in person in New Zealand before the pandemic hit, but this is second best, and second best will have to do. And part of the reason I was interested in joining you is because I'm I think like all of us, we're interested in being in communities where people want to shape the future, not just endure it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about evaluation and frameworks, about how that happens. And while I talk about it from the perspective of evaluation, I'm really a strategist who's interested in getting good feedback on progress. And evaluation has often been something that has gotten away of that, because I don't think often we're altogether clear, even as change makers, how change happens. And so, but one thing I do think we're clear on, Denise, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think the story is the same in New Zealand and in Canada, that we are all pretty good at programmatic interventions, but we know that those help people beat the odds. If we really want to create a society that's a good society for everyone, we actually have to think about systems, because systems hold problems in place and reproduce them sometimes. And if we want to get good outcomes for everyone on scale, we have to change their odds. And I wouldn't mind you reacting to this phrase by Karen Pittman from the Forum on Youth Investment, who spoke at the Vancouver event for Tamarack in 2015. But Denise, does this phrase ring true to you?
That programmatic interventions help people beat the odds and systemic interventions change the odds. Absolutely. We have to bring the systems along with us. They are hugely important to the reach of change as much as anything. Yeah, it definitely resonates with me. Tell me more.
Well, I mean, yeah, isn't it great to have this sort of this poetry from change makers that capture the world in elegant phrases like this. So let's maybe go to the next slide, because I've been preoccupied with this just like you. And ever since I've watched Inspiring Communities in particular evolve, I mean, I see your efforts to make sense of that and compare them to our efforts in Canada to make sense of that. And then know that if we want to talk about systems, well, we actually have to think about, well, how do systems change? And therefore, we often rely on frameworks, don't we, Denise? And you and I, we spent time together a couple of years ago doing a road trip in New Zealand, and we had lots of frameworks that we were sharing and watching frameworks that other people were sharing. And we use frameworks because they help us get some coherency about what we're doing. But as this quote by George E.P. Box illustrates, that whenever we use a framework, we know that models or frameworks are wrong because they can't handle the complexity of what they work, the complexity of what we're doing, but sometimes they're useful. And so when we find a useful framework, we really, while holding it lightly, should see ask what it can reveal to us. And I found a framework recently that I think is really powerful for people involved in community change, both at a local level, as well as if we zoom out and we think about larger scale change, like across all of New Zealand or a province in Canada. So I love this quote, but maybe we'll go to the next slide and test that quote with a story that is quite dramatic and maybe on a scale that is intimidating, but I think is a story that is highly revealing about what it actually takes to move the needle on complex issues. And this is the story of transforming logging practices in northern British Columbia in a rainforest called the Great Bear Rainforest. And this is a huge area. If you take a look, Denise, I don't think you've ever been there, but Canada is a big place, but look at how big a part of Canada this Great Bear Forest is. It's huge.
Yeah, it looks massive to me. I've never been there. It's totally a different scale to what I'm used to.
Terrifically different. And take a look, Denise, at this bear in the middle there. There's a white grizzly bear.
Yeah, beautiful.
Beautiful. I've never seen one, but this is one of the few areas in North America where there are white grizzlies, and there are 25 indigenous communities there, all different language groups, believe it or not, who for all of them this bear is quite sacred, and it's sort of symbolic of the spirituality which First Nations hold this area of Canada, but also the communities that live there. And quite a while ago, the province of British Columbia and the BC logging industry decided to create a planning framework where they would begin to actually target logging practices in that region. Now, that's really interesting because it had never been done before, but of course it evokes an enormous response. And what I want to show you now is tell you a real quick story, a very quick vignette using a framework to interpret how change happened in this particular case study. So if we go to the next slide, it reveals a little bit. And what it is they actually, about 12 years ago, created this multi-stakeholder land use planning process, the BC government and industry. What happened is Indigenous groups were not terribly well organized in the beginning, but the environmental nonprofits were. And so they actually created something called a war in the woods. And they actually had media out in the woods who were tracking logging practices in the woods. And there was 100 new logging camps set up. There were protests. They brought in high value celebrities to come in and talk a little bit more about what was happening in those woods and to raise public awareness. And then concurrently, this group went internationally to create a marketplace campaign to actually let people know where people were getting their wood products from. And they found that the people using these products were from pretty well-known companies, at least in North America. IKEA, everyone knows, Home Depot. In fact, it found 80 companies that were dealing with that and put pressure on international consumers to say boycott these companies because they're drawing wood from this place. And the reason they did that is because they wanted to stop people logging in British Columbia at the level of locality, but they actually had to go internationally to create extra pressure. Well, that pressure worked because 80 companies responded by curtailing or agreeing to phase out wood that was taken from such forests, not just the Great Bear Forest, but from other forests as well. And that generated an immediate loss of $200 million in sales. And it also prompted the BC government and the logging industry to create something called a standstill agreement. So they said, we are no longer going to log more than we have, and we are going to also halt the campaign. And that created, Denise, and it's really hard to show this just with the visual, but it created a period of time where nothing was happening. Someone who was involved in that said it was like two wolves circling each other, just at least agreeing to halt hostilities and start beginning to talk to each other about what might happen. While they were doing that, the 25 First Nations communities created something called the Coastal Nations Alliance and became really well organized, and then grabbed a seat at the table along with the NGOs and created this larger multi-sectoral planning table, which agreed to do these spontaneous experimentation things on the ground, trying new ways to log in a way that were environmentally sensitive, practice ecological-based logging, and responded to sustainable development and Indigenous ways of managing the resources. But these were all spontaneous. There was no big framework, there was no big strategy. It just emerged because they couldn't agree on big things, but they could agree on little things. And so those little things created a little bit of trust. People began to talk to each other. And if you read the evaluation results, people began to even generate insight and empathy of each other's positions. Didn't agree, but they actually began to humanize each other. That created the conditions for shared jurisdiction over the land, not just BC, but also First Nations Coalition generated jurisdiction, an ecological-based management framework, and a whole economic diversification strategy that then led to a $120 million conservation endowment, a Great Bear Forest land use decision, a whole dump load of new formal pilots around ecological-based management, an agreement for the time being to protect at least 30% of the protected areas, with an understanding that that piece of the pie that you see in the top right corner would get even bigger. Now, when we were getting ready for this, there's so many stories that I wanted to tell where this framework helped us interpret some very basic dynamics and insights about how what it takes to make change on complex issues. So more than programmatic interventions, as you see here, the supporting niche innovation level is where we might do normal programmatic stuff. This asks us to take a wider angle lens in what it takes for us to tackle complex issues at scale. Before we get into those insights, we've played with frameworks. You and I had this time together in New Zealand. Well, they do, because they kind of give a little bit of coherency, but there's an amazing story. But what's immediately revealed to you about what it takes to even get to that point where you see those dramatic impacts?
Well, the things that are standing out for me are things about like starting small and the importance of trust and relationship, and how those things have multiplier effects. Like you say, well, what I'm saying is that the model is great, it makes it really clear, but it's probably not like that on the ground, right? It's not exactly useless, but it's only a partial view. But it still helps to highlight some of the key elements, and those are things that can help us navigate. I think that's what I'm taking from this, and that's why I like frameworks, and that's why we've had some great conversations, is they help me navigate gosh, they help me navigate my life, Mark, not just my work. So anyway, let's have a look at your, sorry.
Well, we're all clumsily off in the right direction, hopefully, trying to make sense of the world, and frameworks do that. And you know what, I framed this as, I want to be clear that I framed it because I'm an evaluator who work with groups, and they ask how to track their progress. And people usually talk about metrics. And metrics without understanding what a legitimate outcome is and how to create it are useless, right? I mean, I heard this phrase, and I don't know who to quote, all metrics are simply stories dumbed down. Right? I mean, it's a really good thing, right? It's, you know, there's a story there. Every metric you see, there's a story behind it. So we understand stories, and we could talk about some of the numbers, 120 million of this and 30% of that, but it really doesn't provide nuance and meaning and context. And so here's what that framework showed to me, not only as someone who's interested in change, but someone who's asked to help track. So let's see if we can, with Duncan's help, walk through a couple of things. Number one, we need to widen our gaze about how to get mission level impact. Now, whether it's saving bears or reducing, helping people get better high school graduation rates, et cetera, we actually need accumulation. You know, we talk with the word, Denise, collective impact. I think we need cumulative impact. We need the accumulation of change, mutually reinforcing change at multiple levels. Niche innovations, changing systems, getting public awareness, and of course, navigating this crazy context in which we work, right? We have to, we're navigating now, even if we don't want to, with COVID-19. So number one, we got to widen our gaze. Number two, we have to take capacity and agency building seriously. So we talk about that now, and it's a big, you know, build capacity. Everyone says that. Well, listen, in the case of the Great Bear Forest, look at the profound effect that First Nations organizations organizing 25 very diverse First Nations communities, developing a coalition and creating a multi-stakeholder container to begin to even debate these things. So you don't get those outcomes without capacity building. So we really have to figure this out, and we have to figure out how to build power, yield power, and share power. So
and I really like that you put agency in there as well. It's not just capacity, it's actually the agency, the role that people take, and the conviction to act, if you like, the imagination and conviction to act.
The feeling empowered that I could shape my future, not endure. It's not just capacity, I'm willing to deploy that. I agree.
Yeah.
Well, and then, but this one's a bit harder, Denise, and I know that I kind of, you know, there's a joke here about why did the Canadian chicken cross the road? I'm not going to ask you, Denise, how come?
To get to the other side?
To get to the middle.
All right. Of course, you're so polite.
New Zealand and Canada have some similar features in that way. I actually don't, we often talk about collaboration as everyone being on the same page. Actually, this case study says you don't, sometimes you do. We actually have to embrace conflict and cooperation. Real change requires that we need both. Sometimes we need to build, share, and yield power, and then we have to learn how to cooperate. And I can't go into this, but that case study really is a case study of people who, to use the phrase of Adam Kahane, working with people you don't agree with, like, or trust.
I was just thinking of and what is it? Yeah, that book about stretch collaboration.
It's exactly it.
It's a great piece. What is it called? Collaborating with the enemy.
Collaborating. Maybe we can send that book out to people after, saying that this is really provocative to me, because I grew, you know, when we started, Tamarack and Liz may speak more about this, we really thought everything was about kind of more conventional collaboration, agree on everything. This says, don't think like that. You have moments where that happens, but you have moments of real conflict, and let's not pretend it doesn't happen.
Totally,
so
yeah.
We got to get good at that, right? Maybe one more thought, and then just a final PowerPoint on this, and getting ready to hear from the rest of the folks. We also have to lengthen our gaze. So in a time of, you know, people wanting immediate results, one could kind of zoom in, Louise, and I mean, Denise, and you and I could probably find micro results within short time periods. But the real story here is a long-term story. And we've said this ad nauseum in our field, long-term, long-term. But we are 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and it's cumulative results over time that lead to deep and durable changes. So this is simply a reminder of something that we already know.
That's right. We've got to learn by doing and actually weave that in as we go, right? And there's some things to learn from, I don't know, approaches like tactical urbanism, for example, giving things a go and weaving it in. yeah, lots of things that we can learn. Awesome, lovely insights. What's next?
Well, here's what literally when we were going to meet in New Zealand, I thought we had a whole set of workshops around that, and then this pandemic happened. And so what is happening to me now, in the spirit of we never really stopped thinking about this, I think some of those things are absolutely true. You know, working across scales, at least some of it's partially true. But now we got to think about, if we're change makers, how are we going to deal with disruption? We're used to working with normal, what they would call equilibrium, but we have this disruption, and we have a future where we don't know what's coming. Are we going to return to the old equilibrium, like Back to the Future? Are we going to find a new equilibrium? And, you know, and it might be a nightmare, a dream, or a mix of both. Like, are we going to be better on the other side of this pandemic? Or are we entering into a phase that some people call the long emergency, that and the pandemic has revealed frailties around equity, energy, climate change, etc., that now are rearing their heads, and we actually aren't going to find equilibrium for a while. And I ask that because I think the 5-level framework that we just looked at says widen our gaze, manage cooperation, competition, lengthen our gaze, but that was designed for less bumpy times. We're now into bumpy times, so I don't have any answers to this. I'm just trying to make sense of this, saying we are going to be navigating some uncertain waters going ahead, and we as change makers, funders, evaluators, and policymakers probably have to be open to the possibility that any one of these scenarios could emerge.
Yeah, I totally agree. A lot of our tools work really well when things are relatively stable, you know, when we can backcast from something, but actually that's a tool that doesn't work for me right now. But there are tools too, you know, I think of positive deviance, for example, looking for what is working and how to stretch that, to lift the gaze, to widen it and deepen it, and look for those elements. So these little pictures also remind me of the fitness landscape, and that actually we've got to be nimble as well and very present, which can also be very exhausting. So equally, to borrow from Jacinda, we need to be kind to ourselves as much as anything.
And maybe as a transition statement, Denise, and an acknowledgement of the work of inspiring communities, place now becomes more important than ever.
I think so, yeah. The local scale is really important. We're going to have to keep moving, Mark. We've got a lot to say. It could take all day. The next slide, Duncan. Yeah, so a final comment from Mark that we must learn our way through this. What are you thinking, Jamie? How do we learn our way through this?
So it's kia ora, Denise, and well, you set it up for Mark, but this is actually something he said to me a long time ago, and I think we heard it in the video, is we've got to learn our way through this. And I think it's probably familiar to you, familiar to everyone on the call today, that if you're involved in community innovation, and even in this global situation we find ourselves in, this is our pathway. And I think why is because we're navigating through massive complexity. And what do we know about complexity, right? It's unpredictable, it's dynamic, it's uncontrollable, it's turbulent, and it's not possible to understand the world around us by only looking at the parts. We've got to consider the whole. We've got to connect the global and the local. But also reflecting on something you just said, and that, you know, our ways of working, our experiences, our lessons of history, even our expertise, like there's a lot that doesn't apply anymore, but I think there's a lot that still does, right? That there's patterns and ways of knowing that are probably familiar to us that we can continue to reach to. And so today I've been playing with frameworks. I, like you and Mark, like frameworks. Mark is my emergency framework contact. If I'm trying to think about something, I'm usually like sending him a message, and because of time zones, it's awkward, but he's always there to help. And I think there's several complexity concepts and perspectives that I think will actually be really useful to us in terms of sense making our way through this moment and guiding the kind of actions that we're all trying to take. But before we go there, I just want to reset us as individuals, because I think we are ourselves part of the system, Denise. We affect it, we're affected by it. As you said, we have agency within it. And I think we have to pay attention to how we think, particularly in this moment. How we think critically, but also how we think creatively. So what we know, what we think we know, what we do understand, that just experienced a really big disruption. And so how do we question that, but also remember that? And I think that's actually really difficult for us, well, because we're human and we have built-in challenges to doing that. But rather than have me talk about it, we're going to just show a very brief video that I think gets at this much more effectively. So Duncan, can you put this up?
Leonard, you're giggling in your sleep.
It's not me, it's my new ringtone. The Joker from Batman.
It creeps me out.
Me too, but I paid $3 for it.
So I don't know if any of us are on the call are Big Bang Theory fans, but in this scene, Leonard and Penny are unhappy with Leonard's new ringtone, but he's invested in it. And this is a cognitive bias that's called escalation of commitment. And it happens when we're committed to our ideas and our investments, even when the data clearly demonstrates that the future costs of continuing something outweigh the expected benefits. Often we call this throwing good money after bad. On the screen there are a bunch of other examples of biases. And my sense is that our biases are actually really heightened in the current uncertainty. And they're further challenged because we're dealing with limited data, changing circumstances. And so the how of our thinking is really relevant in this moment. What are my assumptions? What are my uncertainties? How do I know what I know? How can I stress test my thinking? And that's a practice I think we can all just invest a little bit of extra time in right now. But it's not just our own thinking that we need to pay attention to. Because thinking and knowing aren't done separately from others, right? We work in community. We take action together. We need to know and to understand one another. And we depend on a shared sense of the world. And that's highly contingent on social interaction, connection to organizations, networks, communities, even our being within society. And we've really lost some important cues right now. We have less informal interaction, less face-to-face. Probably our circle has gotten smaller. The circle of those we work with has gotten smaller. The institutions and organizations we look to for this are probably closed or maybe otherwise focused. I think it's a lot of implications for building trust, depth of understanding, emerging connections. Some of those practices that were in that case study that Mark was talking about are now much, much harder to do. And so I think the next level of our practice is really being transparent about our assumption, making our thinking visible to others, being explicit about the uncertainties that we are wrestling with, and making that extra effort to connect with others. I think the other thing I want to go to now is this distinction between sense making and action. And these are, of course, really interconnected ideas. There's an interrelationship between the two. And so what I've done, and I think in this quest for framework, is I've become really curious about what are ways we think, Denise, about complexity? What are ways that we approach learning through complexity? And started to map that onto the multi-level framework that Mark introduced us to. And so let's explore some of those. And I'm really going to work through these fairly quickly, thinking that they're really mini prompts. I think some of these will be familiar and a refresh for some of the folks on the call today. I think it'll be a new introduction for others, but they're really cues to go and explore further if any of these grab your attention. Let's start at the bottom. And around taking action, I think it's really helpful for us to remember the distinction between a technical challenge and an adaptive one. We're hearing a lot from experts today, and we need them desperately in many of the things we're contending with. But technical challenges are for well-defined solutions, or well-defined situations with established solutions. They're both the known and the knowable. And those kind of situations, they respond well to expertise. But adaptive challenges are ambiguous and uncertain. There's no roadmap. They're not predictable in advance. And actually expertise is not that helpful. And so we need to build some capacity here around recognizing that difference as we take action. There are technical and adaptive aspects to the pandemic. But I think the other thing we really need are strong feedback loops. And how can we strengthen our own feedback loops? How do we do that act, react, and kind of adapt cycle that we know so well from community work? I think it becomes heightened in importance right now. Similarly in complexity, I think our only hope to understand is through multiple ways of looking at something. Harnessing that diversity is really critical to the kind of innovations that we're going to need to find our way through this. And so what is our capacity to embrace difference? How well do we come at something with different ways of knowing? Are we being interdisciplinary in our approaches? Do we ground in both practice and in theory? And I think, again, these are cues for us to guide our thinking as we try and approach what we're working on. Modeling and prototyping, I think, are very similar versions of the same thing. And I'm going to speak more to prototyping, which really is an activity where we develop versions of an idea. We test them, we get feedback of how something might work in reality. Prototypes should be low cost, low risk, implemented for a short time, and really adjusted through iterations. And I'd like folks to think less of a sort of prototyping as like an event or an activity, and more as a practice. That instinct to do something to learn about the system in which we're operating, to do something to learn more about our ideas before we invest too much in them. Modeling is really the conceptual cousin of prototyping. A fancy version might be a simulation on a computer, but really you can construct and do these as a thought exercise, either individually or in a group. The real sort of complexity stuff really starts to come out as we move up into this nudging system. And I think some of the questions, that are coming up in the chat box, like how do we maintain a focus on changing the odds when we're on emergency mode? I think this idea of path dependence and leverage points are helpful to us here. The equilibrium that Mark was speaking to really relates to path dependence, this idea that over time things are reinforced by historical patterns, structures, power relationships, others. And as things build up, the opportunity cost of changing gets higher and higher. For example, the QWERTY keyboard that all of us probably have in front of us right now. If we were to design a keyboard from scratch today, we wouldn't do it that way. It's not optimal. We would actually design a different keyboard. But changing all of our keyboards and the way keyboards are produced and changing our typing habits, that's extremely difficult. We're not inclined to do that. When things are disrupted in the way they are right now and what we're experiencing, I think some of those path dependencies are now loosened up. Others are probably more reinforced. But if we really want to nudge system, I think a powerful strategy question for us to ask is, what are those path dependencies in the system in which I operate, and how have they shifted? And what new opportunities and constraints are now introduced that we may be able to work on? The idea of leverage points is really about small things having ripple effects. As we take action, I think it's important to pay attention and look for and try and understand unintended consequences, positive and negative. But I think when smaller actions have that disproportionate, bigger effect, that bigger ripple, it's signaling something to us. So this is a place to be scanning and looking and thinking, where are these happening? And are they places to respond within the system in which we're operating? The principles of action piece here, one of the things I'm really noticing that people are working, leading, and organizing in different ways in this new situation we find ourselves in. For example, different tolerances for risk, openness to innovation, patterns of engagement. I think in many ways, the situation is bringing out the best of us. And I think a developmental evaluation opportunity is that we should notice this and take stock of it and try and remember it for the future. Because as things try and stabilize and normalize, let's remember the best of how we are in this moment. What are those things we do in the way that we know to work in community, and what value do they provide? And so they don't disappear in the future. We're almost there, Denise, just a couple, and I know we want to get to the main event, which is Liz, but I'll go really quickly on these last three. This idea of scenarios, there's a lot of futures work around preparing and anticipating different future situations. And I think the tool here is really us thinking about holding multiple scenarios simultaneously. Kind of the way that Mark was suggesting with those different future equilibriums. We don't know what's going to play out, but can we create a narrative around what each of those might look like? And what are our strategies to respond in each of those? And are there really robust strategies that might make sense no matter which one? Are there things that we know how to do or know we should do that we want to go to in any of those scenarios? Lastly, I think we need to pay attention to the gaps. A lot of you on the call probably have an on-the-ground perspective, and I think that's really valuable. Resources and focus have shifted, and I think people are being affected in new and different ways. Let's use our sight lines to really catch those that are affected. And we're anticipating some of these, like mental health responses to isolation, but I think there's a lot that are not immediately visible. And can we find those, locate them, and draw attention to those in this larger system. And then lastly, this idea of probe, which is very similar to prototype, but really to understand a complex system, we need to probe it. Simple actions to generate feedback. And I think this is where I want to wrap up, which is more like a call than a tool. But I think that call is to take action in ways that are unfamiliar and familiar, and to do so with courage, because that's what the world needs right now. So thank you, Denise, for having us. Lovely to be with all of you virtually, and I'm going to pass it back to you and over to Liz.
Thanks, Jamie. That's great. There's a lot in my mind about that. I guess I'm really reminded that we see what we're looking for, and that it's important to recognise that we know so much, and that's really great. We sometimes know that we don't know everything, and there's a whole lot of stuff we don't know that we don't even know. So we do need that multiple view that you were talking about, and that adaptive stuff too. There's some great literature there, isn't there, about that zone of disequilibrium, which totally feels like where we are now.
There is, and I think if people are curious about any of this, Inspiring Communities, you're an incredible resource around a lot of these complexity tools, and just encourage people to reach out and connect with you on that.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, one of the things I think that we have to offer are those principles too, those principles of action, and sometimes clarity, for me at least, comes when I think about how these principles been put into action at those different stages. But Liz, let's talk with you. This dance of sense making and action taking, it requires a bit of choreography. I hope you're a good choreographer, Liz, today.
It is. It does take a lot of choreography, and it's almost like a tango, right? Where different people are leading at different times, and the music is quite vibrant. So, hi, Denise. I'm the final batter in this series, and I just wanted to start. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're seeing from the Tamarack lens, and really trying to understand, how different people are looking at the pandemic, and then what it means from a leadership perspective. And this first slide is a paper that I wrote in 2017, which, I was saying to some folks on my team that it seems a little bit prophetic. Who knew that we would be where we are in 2020? But at that time, I was really thinking about collective action, collective impact, and really thinking about sometimes we buy into this idea that things will be the same forever, and yet they're not. We know that even as we begin to intervene in community, we start to see lots of shifts. And Mark's framework and Jamie's explanation of the framework really is quite illustrative of that. And so when I wrote the paper, I kind of landed on 5 principles, I guess, not unlike Inspiring Communities principles, but these were the ones that I was thinking about from a collective action, collective impact kind of perspective. And the one thing that I thought that was really critical was the role of individuals who are living the experience, that kind of equity lens, that citizen lens, and how do we pay attention to that, and how do we really understand that? The notion of working across boundaries. And Jamie, you led into this this slide really well, this notion of being courageous, right? Being able to take risks, but really kind of understanding what those risks are, and speaking truth to power. Those are some of the ideas that came out of that paper. And I think, even these couple of years later, they kind of stand the test of time. But as I was thinking about that, then I started to look at, what are other people thinking about when they're trying to navigate this pandemic and these situations that we're finding ourselves in. And, in the Harvard Business Review, John Kelch came up with the 7 leadership principles for managing in a time of coronavirus. And I think that they're interesting, right? This notion of being calm, that we need this calm leadership. We really do need to say, okay, so there's a lot of chaos happening around us. What's that kind of calmness that we bring to the situation? What's the confidence that we have in not only dealing with what's happening today and tomorrow, but also what might be happening in the future? And can we use data, and can we use, our sense of community to really predict with some confidence what might happen? We might not have all the answers, but we certainly have some answers, and that's a really critical principle for leadership. He talks a lot about communications and collaboration, and I think what's really interesting and what I've seen appear over and over again in a lot of the papers that are emerging right now is this kind of refocus on community. And Mark said it in his presentation, and Jamie reaffirmed it in his presentation. But I do think, you know, this really important relationship that we have with community and the role that community plays, you know, that collective action that we see and are witnessing in communities across Canada and communities across New Zealand and in other places, that response has been so important. But we also are seeing more and more the evolution of community in a different way online with our work teams and with our, you know, with our colleagues. And also I'm seeing more and more community happening even in our family situations. And I know that on the weekend, we sponsor a Zoom call for my family, and it's not just my local family, but we reach across borders and across boundaries, and we have our relatives in Europe join us, we have our relatives who live in the Philippines join us, and we have actually much more community, much more of a virtual community than we've had, you know, when we do our face-to-face community, because we can't bring our colleagues and our relatives from those other countries into conversation with us. And so it is providing us with a different sense of, you know, family and community. And then, you know, the seventh principle, which I think might affront some of us that work in the community sector, this notion of cash, right? And I think his point is that we have to pay attention to this, not only in the short term, but also in the medium and long term. And I think it is what I would maybe reframe it. He's trying to go with the 7 C's. I might reframe it as resources. What are the resources that it takes for us to maintain stability in the short term, but also what are the resources that we're going to need to navigate through the short, the medium, and the long term? And so helpful, I think. The next slide really comes from some of the work of the around sustainability. And I think that this is helpful for us when we think about, you know, not only the COVID crisis that we're, you know, currently in the midst of, but also thinking about it from, you know, the climate crisis and some of the other things that we have encountered. And so the 3 points here, I really think are things that we're seeing now, but actually are things that we want to think about in terms of a low carbon future. And it's things like resilience. How do we build resilience? How do we mine the fact that communities and institutions create that sense of adaptability and resilience and have really played this important role moving forward? I think the second point around stimulus, we're seeing governments of all sorts, you know, step into this stimulus package from an economic perspective, but then it really must be sustainable. And we saw, I think, yesterday, Sweden implement a universal basic income. And so how do we really look at stimulus in a way that it's a way of creating resources for everybody, particularly folks that are, you know, feeling the inequitable impact of things like Corona and will feel the inequitable impact of climate change. And I think, you know, the final point on this one, that inequity is magnified, that's something that we have to pay attention to. Certainly, you know, the work at Tamarack and working with a whole variety of communities across Canada and the US around place-based poverty reduction, we really are seeing that sheltering in place for someone who has, you know, middle class or wealth is easy, but increasingly sheltering in place for someone who doesn't have a home is much more difficult. And you start to see, you know, how inequity plays out in terms of who is more resilient to the pandemic and who's less resilient to the pandemic. And then the final piece that I wanted to share is a paper that we just published today. So Tim Broadhead is the former CEO of the McConnell Family Foundation and is also a board member at Tamarack currently. And he wrote in 2008 a paper called Not Letting a Crisis Go to Waste. And this paper was written after the financial crisis of 2008. And what was really interesting about that paper was that he said, you know, this is a time that we should really focus on what's the innovation emerging from that crisis, and then how do we leverage that innovation going forward. And so I reached out to Tim and I said, hey, Tim, that was a really good paper that you wrote in 2008. Would you be willing to reprise it and think about this current crisis that we're in? And so he actually did, and we've just recently published it, and we'll make it available to everybody. But what he said was, coming out of 2008, there was not as much innovation as he'd hoped for in the private sector, but there was significant innovation in government and the community sector. So we started to see things like impact investing move forward in Canada. And we also saw the emergence of collective impact. And so those were two innovations that he noted. What he's seeing now coming out of the COVID crisis are 4 or 5 things that are, I think, really important for us to note. And so, you know, as Jamie and Mark have said in their presentations, you know, let's really figure out how we live the future as if it is today. How do we continue to have this recognition of the vital role that community organizations play in supporting communities during times of crisis? How do we continue to keep that front and center with government and with other stakeholders? You know, he's also recognizes that decisive government action is critical to creating stability in times of crisis. And there is a critical role that government plays, you know, in our lives, and that's come to the forefront in and during the COVID crisis. And we only need to look to your leadership in New Zealand to understand the importance of government leaders, that facts and experience matter. So data is critical. And so really understanding and modeling has led for some countries to different kinds of outcomes for citizens in those countries. That actions are really, that were formerly considered to be too costly, are now affordable. And so how do we ask really provocative questions about that? Things like universal basic income and subsidies for, you know, certain communities and certain citizens in our communities. How do we keep those to the forefront? And then the final thing that Tim talked about that I think is equally true in Canada as it would be as it is in New Zealand and in other countries, is that Canadians are mobilizing and that they are coming together to confront this threat to our country. And you know, if we think about this going forward in terms of the climate crisis that we're also in, you know, these 5 points, I think, are critical in terms of advocating for the change that we want to envision together. And then I guess I'm going to just wrap up because Jamie did such a great job in showing how this fit within the landscape slide that Mark shared. And I kind of took the 5 points of the paper, from the paper, you know, that disruptive times call for skilled change makers or require skilled change makers. And I placed them on this slide. And you know, I do think that there is this call to action that we all have inside of us. We're doing the hard work of community change, but in times of change and in times of crisis, I think the call to action is that we even have to go a bit deeper. And, you know, I've been thinking a lot more about how do we lean into living the future as if it is today, because, you know, the change we want to see is happening right now, and we have to continue to live it as we move forward. So I'll throw it back to you, Denise.
Thanks, Liz. It's fascinating. I think what's coming up for me is that a lot of things, but those provocative questions, and the courage is also about the courage to recognize that our old normal wasn't great for lots of people, you know, so some of these things are new for some of us perhaps, but there's lots of people who have been on the outer edge of neoliberalism for a long time and suffering in many ways. So some of those things about collective and all that, there's a whole lot of provocative questions we need to ask of ourselves and how we want to be and what we want to do in here and how we want to redistribute things in these new normals. I think, yeah, courageous decision making has to include everyone, as Mark said, and certainly learning from these perspectives and taking it deeper, learning from those lived experiences and perspectives too. And how do we grow capacity there when you're still trying to put shoes on kids and food on the table, you know? There's some really big opportunities here. And the system has a lot of power too, and contracting and things like that. You know, we can actually, thinking about the climate kind of stuff, put some bottom lines in that are different now, you know, that represent the 4 well-beings as we have in local government here, but a whole bunch of other things as well. So I'm keen to get some questions from other people. So as we start considering your questions and getting those through, let's just wrap up this with all 3 of you just for a minute, maybe do a little bit of a round around actually what do we consider doing more of in this courageous, provocative, unique kind of situation? What might we do less of or change? Do you want to come back on, Mark and Jamie, and just as we're getting those questions together, very quickly, a couple of thoughts on that. Jamie, do you want to start?
Less of talking and more of listening. I mean, I think, you know, there's, watching the chats, there's some really excellent points being made around how there's some real hurt in the world right now, and a lot of that's not as visible as it should be. And I think those of us that, or all of us, need to just pay attention to that in really sort of thoughtful ways.
Yeah, I agree. Not as visible as it should be to some people, and acutely, painfully visible to others. Yeah. So I'm also impressed that you've been able to watch the chat, because I obviously can't multitask as well as you can. That's awesome. Thanks, Jamie. What about you, Mark? What are you thinking around things that we need to change or do differently or do more of?
Someone asked about how do you manage this when you're so busy creating crises? And I don't know if people are familiar with the 3 Horizons framework by McKinsey and Company. And it's a useful way of thinking about it. And I thought this was another example of turning something from managing during stability to managing during crisis. And they argue that Horizon 1 is incremental innovation, improve things. Horizon 2 is disruptive innovation, be bolder and change your systems, but still keep the same game, slightly different rules. And Horizon 3 is disruptive innovation. Different game, different rules. Be transformational in your vision. Now, when you have a crisis, this all gets turned upside down, because Horizon 1's no more incremental innovation, it's triage. Like, do your best just to manage and cope. And I think we're all triaging now. And I think that's what the point was in the chat room. How do you innovate? Horizon 2 is maybe get ready for post-recovery response, which is do your best to figure out how we're going to deal with this again if it ever happens. But Horizon 3 is interesting. I think this is what we were all saying, is have a little bit of time and energy getting ready to employ ideas that now have a chance of being born, because they couldn't during times of inertia and equilibrium. Liz, you mentioned the universal basic income in Sweden. I haven't seen that yet. That's quite a surprise. You know, this is the time to make these things go around. And Milton Friedman says, you know, it's only during crisis where you make change, and you make change because of the ideas that are lying around. So what kind of ideas that have been lying around that we've all wanted to impose to progress for so long that are now possible? But it does require that we not pretend we're not doing triage, not pretend that we're not getting ready for post-pandemic recovery, but how do we in the meantime save a little bit of energy to give birth to those ideas that have waited so long to be born?
It's a lot to juggle, isn't it? And I'll come to you, Liz. You might want to put your microphone on too. But I'm reminded, Mark, of that other, I've forgotten his name, that culture eats strategy for breakfast as well. So there's another thing to hold, right, in this space. Liz, before we go to questions, because you must be getting quite close to time, what are your last thoughts on that, or responses to that?
So I was noticing on the chat box that I said Sweden, but it's actually Spain. And I thank everybody on the chat box for correcting me on that. You're absolutely right. I was just thinking the north the northern countries would adopt that more quickly, but it is Spain. I think, you know, for me, the horizons, thinking about this in horizons is very helpful. But I also think, you know, this notion of thinking about the future and trying to live it, right? We're going to host a webinar at Tamarack coming up in May with Glenda Eoin from Human Systems Dynamics. And that's the theme of the webinar, is really how do we live the future like it is today? And that's what I've been playing around with in my brain, is how do we, you know, praise those good things that seem to be the points of innovation, and really try to get some lift under those points of innovation so that we can continue to move them forward.
Totally. Duncan, let's go to some questions if we can squeeze it in. I know our time is probably out, but let's try and do a couple.
Yeah, we're just up against time. I'll pose maybe 2 questions to the group. The first one has come up quite a bit in chat, so I'm just going to pull it out of the list. It comes from Megan. As we move soon, hopefully, from lockdown to recovery, what needs to happen so that we can move from top-down leadership, which we've needed, to enable more collaborative, community-led responses to recession and recovery?
Well, Mark and I actually were talking about this the other day when we were talking about Collective Impact 3.0, and we were musing in Collective Impact in that webinar about the notion of collective action and how we're seeing more and more collective. It's always been there, but we're seeing more and more instances of collective action really emerging in communities. And so, you know, I think there's a real opportunity for those of us involved in community change to pay attention to that collective action and to lift it up, to understand what's behind it, and then to try to think about how do we build those connections even deeper now, so that, you know, post-pandemic, we're able to continue to engage people in meaningful ways in their communities.
Good points. What about you, Mark? What are you thinking? I saw you leaning into that question.
Oh, given we have a short amount of time, I think, Liz, you summarized our chat the other day with a lot of other people quite well.
Awesome. Thank you. Any thoughts, Jamie, on that?
2. One, I think, you know, just picking up on my previous comment, there's a foundation in Canada I do some work with, and one of their principles is making private troubles public. And so, the extent to which we can create a bigger narrative around what is often invisible and subterranean in the current context will be really important, I think, as we start to come out of this. And for me, it's, you know, in this, I'm channeling Michael Quinn-Patton, who's, you know, a colleague and really a mentor to particularly Mark and I on evaluation. It's about the messy middle, right? It's not top down versus ground up. It's really that middle space where, you know, we are operating within a policy environment that's actually in a lot of change, and that may be helpful to us. And how do we bring that together with the kind of ground up perspective and work that we're really trying to advance? So I think it's a both and not an either or.
Yeah, and good to ask ourselves some powerful questions like that too, eh? How do we? What's your next question, Duncan?
Yeah, this will just have to be a quick one just because we're over. But it's from Karen. What place do councils have in assisting communities find their new normal? And other couple of questions just about finding new normal in general in these disruptive times.
Do you want to start for us this time, Mark?
Well, I'll be quick. You know, I'm a big fan of David Snowden, who many people are, Cognitive Edge, and there's sort of a principle in complexity that go where the energy is, and where it's really good, you amplify it, and where it's really negative, and we're probably going to see a lot of negative stuff. We haven't seen a ton of it yet, some to dampen it. And so I think most communities are going to respond, and there'll be some extraordinarily positive things, and that's probably context specific, right? So where is there profound, I can't see leaving this crisis and people not talking about local food systems more, right? Like literally, so how many people will, there might be a lot of energy around that. So I think every community is going to have its own local story about where is there really good energy, and then you go chase it and amplify it.
And I totally agree. I think it is, what is that local story? What is mattering to people here? Because we tend to hear voices that are a bit like ours, you know, going back to that kind of cognitive bias a little bit. So how do we amplify the voices we're not hearing just because we're not seeing the energy? It might still be there. Yeah. Jamie, any thoughts on that? Very quick.
Yeah, really like what you said, Mark. I wouldn't add too much to that, other than I think, you know, we're at, certainly in Canada, sort of this phenomenal sort of bipartisan moment, but that will end. And so the quest for a return to normal, ergo, like, let's go back to the way things were, will at some point, we'll be at a fork in the road with an aspiration to a more progressive future. And I think just really gearing ourselves up in terms of the narrative around why a progressive future that opportunity is in front of us, and how do we best position ourselves to take that will be pretty important.
Yeah, no one left behind, eh? No collateral damage, or much less, please. Liz, a couple of final words.
I would just echo what Mark and Jamie have said. Awesome.
Those were really good final words. So we're going to have to wrap up. I'm so sorry we didn't get to more questions today. I really wish we had more time, you know, that's why we had a week, really, isn't it? So we've done well to do what we've been able to do. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation, audience, listeners, and we can certainly connect more. Inspiring Communities has a few ways that we can do that. There's connect groups, for example, small groups of people who come together online once a month, usually groups of peers or people who are in a similar place or region. They are free for April and May, so have a look at the Inspiring Communities website for those. I think the first one starts quite soon, actually, might be the 9th even, but they're starting all the time. And there's also some other ways that Inspiring Communities is working out to continue online conversation too. So keep an eye out on the website and the Facebook page for those. The details are on the side there. I'm going to hand back to you, Duncan, to just finish us off. And just want to say it was a real privilege to host that conversation with the three of you and to see what I could see in the chat as well. To all of you out there, have a lovely day. Go well.
Yeah, thank you, Denise, and thank you, everyone. As I mentioned in the chat, we're going to be sending everyone an email with the full recording of the call, as well as a collection of the slides and some of the links and resources that were mentioned. So thank you, everyone who found links and asked for them. That's all going to be sent to you in the coming days. As well, if you're interested, the Tamarack Institute has a variety of free community building webinars coming up over the course of April and May, and we encourage you to look at the link on your screen if you're interested in joining us again. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us and sharing your wisdom and your thoughts and questions. I hope everyone has a wonderful day.